The political crisis continues in Egypt following a night of large protests in multiple cities and violent clashes outside the presidential palace in Cairo. Many hundreds of Egyptians gathered in opposition to President Mohamed Morsi's decree granting himself sweeping powers and the proposed constitution. But what started as a peaceful protest turned violent when clashes erupted with pro-Morsi Muslim Brotherhood supporters. At least 5 people were killed and hundreds injured. Today, the Egyptian army deployed tanks and erected barricades outside the palace. Despite the military presence, some clashes continued today. For more, we're joined by journalist Aya Batrawy in Cairo. Welcome back to Free Speech Radio News.
Thank you.
What happened outside the presidential palace last night, and how serious were these clashes?
What happened was around mid-afternoon, there had been a very small, peaceful sit-in of anti-Muslim Brotherhood protesters, and protesters who had gathered there from the night before when there were tens of thousands of people marching through the streets of Cairo, approaching the presidential palace, to demand that the president listens to them and rescinds these presidential decrees that gave him near absolute powers over not just the executive branch, but also legislative and judiciary. So these 200 or 300 protesters had been left over from the night before of that protest and were basically just holding a peaceful sit-in there and had erected about 7 or 8 tents, not blocking traffic and very far away from the movement of cars or anything. What happened was the Muslim Brotherhood called on its members, and I would like to stress the Muslim Brotherhood party specifically, of which the president is still a member of, called on its parties to take to the streets in front of the presidential palace and claim the legitimacy of the president by moving into that area and essentially kicking those people out. And so what they did was they came in with rocks and they came in with sticks and they forcibly removed the protesters who were sitting there, and they tore down their tents and they started throwing rocks at everyone or anyone who was in the street who was not part of their march, including myself as a journalist and other bystanders. And it's a highly residential area, so people living there, people who work there, were also caught up in this and were also roughed up.
The army erected barricades around the presidential palace after these protests. How did the security forces respond at the time this was going on around you?
When the Brotherhood approached in the mid-afternoon, there was no response by security, and there was no security to be seen anywhere. And I think, it's a mix between the security still not having its full powers back to be able to go into the streets. The security apparatus under the former president operated based on fear and torture, and that no longer exists like before in the same capacity. And so, to a certain extent, the police forces don't have the ability to go into the streets like before. The other thing is there's a feeling in a sense that the police are sort of letting the protesters from both sides sort of hash it out, since these at the end of the day were protesters who at one point were very much unified against these police forces last year. Another thing as well is that in the evening after these protesters, the Brotherhood protesters had forcibly removed this peaceful sit-in, the anti-Brotherhood protesters gained in numbers and started to attack the Brotherhood sit-in at that point in the evening. And that is when the clashes became extremely violent, extremely aggressive, Molotov cocktails being thrown, tear gas being fired, not clear who's firing who on what. And that's when the riot police came in, and that's when the riot police got caught up in between the two sides, and it became a complete chaos.
What role was the army playing at this stage?
The Republican Guard specifically, whose job is to protect presidential properties, was deployed outside of the presidential palace to create sort of a buffer around that area. And so the Brotherhood have now withdrawn from that area. They left around 4 p.m. here in Cairo. And the anti-Brotherhood protesters and those who are genuinely protesting rather than going out to support, but who are actually opposing and protesting the president, are still insisting to keep up with their march and are planning marches toward the palace regardless of whether the Republican Guard troops remain there or not.
Were there demonstrations in other cities apart from Cairo?
Yes, there were demonstrations all throughout the country, which is something, unfortunately, the media doesn't focus enough on. But there were in Alexandria, in the northern coastal city, and there were in many other places. There were, I think, at least 2 Brotherhood offices which were torched yesterday by protesters. And so definitely the country is highly, highly polarized. And the violence is spreading and it's expanding and it's becoming, even to a certain extent, a bit sectarian or a bit pro and anti-Islamist and having overtly religious tones to it.
What are the Cairo residents there telling you about this latest crisis?
Egyptians, particularly in the Heliopolis neighborhood of Cairo, of which I'm from, my family's from, are extremely shocked because these kinds of protests and this kind of violence and destruction of streets has happened mostly in downtown in Tahrir Square. This is the first time that this level of violence hits such an upscale, quiet residential neighborhood. And a lot of Egyptians, whether they live in this neighborhood or not, are extremely, extremely sad to see Egyptians fighting Egyptians. This is not a civilian force fighting a police force or fighting a military establishment. These are Egyptians fighting Egyptians. And the irony is that the two sides, when you put them on the neutral streets in which there were no clashes, you really couldn't tell the difference between the two sides. And at the end of the day, they are both dressed in the same clothing, and they're both eating from the same, cheap street food vendor, and they're still both struggling with the same demand, which is everybody in Egypt went down to the streets demanding social justice, equality, and freedom. And until today, I think a lot of Egyptians are still struggling to achieve that, regardless of whether they're with the Brotherhood or they're against the Brotherhood.
Aya Batrawy in Cairo, thanks very much for talking with Free Speech Radio News.
Thank you so much.